continuation of the previous chapter, it's important to keep in mind the direction that Jesus' teachings are going by the time we get to this chapter. At the end of chapter 24, specifically verse 45, Jesus begins to teach about two types of people: the faithful and wise servant and the evil servant. The faithful would rule over his goods. The evil would be cut apart and set apart to share the same fate as the hypocrites. And this chapter is a further explanation of these scenarios, remembering that these were unbroken teachings by Jesus when they were written. However, we've broken them into chapters, and sometimes that makes it easier for us to forget what was going on or what was even being taught in the previous chapter. Most often it's more than just a few previous verses that are important. Sometimes it's the whole thought of the other chapter. But in this particular case, verse 45 and the remaining verses of the end of that chapter start this teaching that we're going to be dealing with. Now, the reason why I decided to read everything in its entirety in the beginning is because I wanted everyone to hear the scriptures as well as I could read them for the moment in their entirety, so that it could be understood as one continuous thought. But I've decided to take a big picture approach to this study, combined with a summary of each section, to use more time to highlight what I believe are the most important features of each section. However, I hope that in no wise does it feel rushed or incomplete. I definitely plan to be as concise and detailed as I possibly can on those points that Jesus is trying to bring out with his teaching. But this chapter is basically divided into three sections, two parables. The parable of the 10 virgins, the first section. The second section is the parable of the talents. You can give many names for it, but that's one that's the most popular. And the last one is actually what I would call the separation at the judgment. This is different. It's not a parable, but it's simply a summary of an event that will occur in the future. So he doesn't compare it to this or that. He just simply gives a scenario. He just tells what's going to happen at the end. He is not going to be like a man who sits on the throne of his glory. He will be the king that sits on the throne of his glory. It will not be like the nations are gathered before him. The actual nations will be gathered in front of him. And so this one, I think, is unique because it ends with more realism and less of the comparisons, but it's still just as important in its own right. But, as I said, big picture approach. So the big picture, the theme, I believe, of the chapter is good servants versus evil servants. That's really what we're dealing with. Jesus is most likely only talking about good servants versus evil servants because only his servants are the ones he's dealing with. They were the only audience at the time, according to verse 3 of the previous chapter. So he's dealing with his disciples and teaching them about the two types of servitude. He is not talking or not teaching about those who have not decided to serve him. Now, there are other parables and there are other times when he has done that. As a matter of fact, the parable of the talents in other scripture, I believe it's called the parable of the 10 minas, or the parable of the minas, it actually does include a group that does not follow him, a third group that does not serve him or worship him is included. But it was because that group could hear his teaching, and he added it to speak to them. But he didn't need to speak to any other group than those who were his servants. And so therefore he lays out the requirements of serving him and makes a clear distinction between the outcomes of each. So if it wasn't obvious for any of his servants that they needed to be the good and faithful servant and not the evil servant, then that could be their aha moment that they should be the good servant and get the good rewards rather than to have the recompense of evil for their evil deeds. But that is for us to look into further as we go into each of these sections. So, what is the parable of the 10 virgins about? Well, it's about being prepared or unprepared for Christ, and particularly the return of Christ. But when you are prepared for Christ, we understand in this day and time, whether we are still on this earth when he comes, or whether we have already passed on and are waiting to be resurrected when he returns, we still need to be ready for his return. And so here we have only one class of person, the virgin. There was only one type of person, which was a virgin. But they were split into two types. There are two types of virgin. There is a wise virgin, and there is a foolish virgin. And so in this, we see Christ is depicted as a bridegroom, and these virgins were preparing to attend his marriage. Something that they would commonly understand in their day and time. You know, this we have to definitely lean toward the spiritual principle, because sometimes the scenarios and the parables that he gives don't really match up to things that are common for us. But if we step back into that time and realize that this was common and this was understood, then hopefully we can, of course, glean more from it. Their virginity represented their servitude. So in a sense, they were prepared, and that's just like a servant. A servant is in a sense prepared because they've agreed and they've made reservations in their mind and most likely in their lifestyle to be prepared to serve someone. Whether they actually do it or not, they have gone through some formal agreement to be a servant. And that's what the virginity represents. They are servants. They are for Christ, and they are waiting for him. He hadn't arrived yet, but they needed to be ready to meet him at any time. They didn't know when it was going to be. They weren't told, so they had to be ready. Now, there could be several ways to describe the meaning of the lamp and the oil that they had with them, but we know that lamps are needed to see when it's dark. And for those that, lamps that use oil, of course, then you need the oil to fuel the lamp, to keep the light burning. Coincidentally, they heard a call at midnight to go to the bridegroom, requiring the need to use their lamps and oil since it would be dark. So it was a perfect scenario. I do, however, favor Proverbs chapter 6, verse 23. And the reason why is because it says that God's commandment is a lamp and the law is light. It just fits perfectly in my mind for those both to be mentioned. And then here we have this parable which includes both. I believe, to go along with those, that the oil could represent their consistency to obey the laws and commandments. Because yes, the law is the law is good. The commandment is a lamp and the law is a light. But without your consistency to keep it a lamp in your life, then it will go out for you, even though it doesn't lose its power, but it loses its effectiveness with you. And so I thought to myself, well, what can fuel the law? What can fuel the commandments? Well, our minds, our determination, to be consistent to the commands. That's what keeps it bright. I mean, what puts out our light as Christians? When we don't follow God's commandments, we're not shining bright. Now, we are still an example, but not of what we should be. And so that's why I think the oil could, perhaps represent the consistency to keep the commandments and the law. But as we move forward, we see that all 10 fell asleep. And I believe that sleep here is indicating being unaware and does not mean being spiritually asleep, which is sinful. I further believe that because as we proceed on, there's almost no mention of the fact that they slept. And it seems to be very important when you're dealing with the subject of readiness. If you do anything contrary to readiness, surely there would be a consequence for that. But we don't see sleep being a consequence. And so that leads me to believe that it's just the idea that you don't know what's going on. And so therefore, they weren't knowing that he was coming at that moment. But what happened after that? They awoke. And what did they awake to? The call to meet the bridegroom. So something got their attention and woke them all up, which makes sense because they were waiting for the call, so they understood what the call sounded like. But here's where we get the differentiation between the two. It wasn't the sleep that was different. It was common to them. Their virginity was common. Even their lamp and their waiting for the bridegroom was common. But here's where we see that 5 of the virgins, who the Bible or Christ talks about them being foolish, realized that they did not have enough oil to keep their lamps lit, to guide them to the marriage. Because that's where they're headed. They need the lamp to guide them to the marriage. So it wasn't like they heard a call and then all of a sudden he was right before them. It appears that they still needed to travel a destination as far as the parable is concerned in order to get to the marriage. But they wanted the 5 wise virgins to share their oil. But that wasn't possible. So in the context of the parable, that makes sense because they brought enough for themselves. And so if they gave some of theirs to someone else, which they could do in the parable, they would run out. And then their lamp would go out. And how would they be able to see at midnight? How would they be able to see when they're traveling in the dark? They couldn't see. And so they said to themselves, no, we're not going to do that. And so not only were they wise to bring enough, but they were also wise enough to realize that they can't compromise their own salvation for someone else. But the fact is that each person only had enough oil for themselves. Similarly, each person in real life must obey God for themselves. 1 Peter 4 verse 18 tells us, the righteous are scarcely saved, meaning with difficulty. So the righteous, one individual righteous person, it is difficult for that person to get in. How do you think they got in? With their own effort. So it is difficult for us to get ourselves in. This is not talking about the influence that we can have on other people. Because you can influence someone, but what do they do with the influence? They respond favorably, hopefully, and then they do what they're supposed to do themselves. So it doesn't change the fact that they are still responsible for their own actions, even if you help them. But 1 Peter 4:18 says, it's hard. It's with difficulty. It takes a lot of effort for one person to make it in for themselves. So the question is, how can anyone obey God as if there were 2 or more people? Or which of us? Or do we know anyone that has ever been so righteous that they had salvation credits that they could share with someone else. Only Christ. And we know what it takes in order to receive the benefit of his effort. Once again, it's still the individual effort, and that's what this parable is pointing out. Not that they were being stingy, or not that they wanted them to not to make it, because we can see to the contrary. They did want them to make it. They did want to help them. The 5 wise virgins suggested the only thing they could, only thing that they could tell them, which was for the foolish ones to try to correct their deficiency before it was too late. We have to understand that that's what's going on here. There seems to be another effort to correct the deficiency, to correct the fact that their oil is missing before it was too late. But while they went, the bridegroom came. The bridegroom came, and so therefore, the wise virgins were on their way to meet him. They heard the call, and they started going toward the call. And Christ came. He was there to meet them. This is not a parable about being able to prepare until the end. This parable is about being prepared before the end. The problem was they hadn't purchased enough oil. But Scripture mentions elsewhere about the benefit of purchasing enough of what is needed in order to be ready. For instance, buy the truth and sell it not. Every time I think of that, I hear Brian. I hear Brian's prayer, right? That's what we should be. Buyers of the truth and sellers not. Not meaning that we're not willing to share it. It means that it doesn't leave us. The truth always remains with us. And we've sacrificed everything to get it. Our lifestyle, our old way of thinking. We want the truth, and we want to keep the truth. How much truth should you buy? As much as you can. As much as you can afford. But it doesn't end there. This is Proverbs 23:23. It says, buy the truth and sell it not. But it also says to buy wisdom, truth, and understanding. There's more to it. Another verse, buy gold tried with fire. Buy white raiment. Clean garments that are not stained. Buy eye salve. Where is this from? Revelation chapter 3, verse 18. Speaking to one of the churches. How much were they supposed to buy? All they could afford. As much as they could afford. What did Jesus do? How much did Jesus have? Did he say, no, I'm good? I like that treasure right there. That's a pearl. That's a great price. But hey, I'm going to shoot you a deal. I'm going to give you half of what I got. Maybe even a little bit more than that. No. He gave all he had. It takes all you have. And knowing that the source, the one that sells it to us, is God and is Christ, certainly we know that he's very generous as a dealer of truth and wisdom and all these wonderful things. Certainly he would give us those things in abundance if we're willing to work to receive it. But they tried to purchase what they needed after it was too late and they were rejected. So the moral of this parable, don't wait. Purchase now. Be ready right now. Next, what is the parable of the talents about? The big picture is being productive or unproductive for Christ. Just like the previous parable, one class of person, servant. That's the only people that are being addressed here is servants. Yet again, it's split into two types, just like the wise and foolish virgins. Here they are described as good and faithful versus wicked and slothful or lazy. So we see a pattern here. Jesus is painting these pictures, mental pictures for their benefit. Now, Christ is a traveling man who called his servants so he could deliver his goods to them in order for them to multiply those goods through work. That's the purpose. That's why they're servants, because they need to be doing something for the one they work for. For the benefit of following my explanation, I'm going to use the word goods, and sometimes perhaps maybe some other descriptions, in place of talents. And the reason why is because we're so used to using talents to describe abilities and not money. But the thing is that it doesn't mean they have to be so far away from each other. However, if you read carefully, you will notice that the talent and the ability were different. We use them in our language as the same, but when you read it, it says the man, being Christ, distributed his talents to his servants based on their individual ability. He looked at their ability and said, I will give you my goods, my talents, my money, based on your abilities. So after distributing the goods, he leaves on a long journey. Well, this is Christ going back to heaven after his resurrection, but leaving his goods to his servants before he left. One servant received 5 of his money, another 2, and the last just received 1 of the goods from the master. They all had the ability to double their money with work. Now, this doesn't tell us straight out, but I think that is implied. But only 2 chose to do so. I think that the simple math of doubling what they were given symbolizes 100% effort. They gained from every one of the goods. Every single one of that money, those goods, needed to be multiplied. But here's the thing, both the goods that they received in the beginning and the gain from them belonged to the man who gave them. He gave it to them to multiply because when he returned, he was going to take both. They're his. The servants were multiplying for him, not themselves. And that's why the last servant did not do any work with what he was given. He knew that upon the master's return, he would have to give up what he was given. And so therefore, his own excuse was fear. I was afraid of you. I was afraid of that you would come and take back all the stuff that's yours. I mean, I guess there are people like that today. You know, if they get a car that they know they can't pay for and they're afraid that it's going to get taken away. Maybe that's, quite similar. But of course, this person has no excuse, and I'm not saying those people do either. But this is what is supposedly going on in his mind. But he didn't want to give them up. So instead, he just decided to do nothing with what he was given, which is sad. However, when he thought that he could get away with it by excusing it as fear, the Lord properly interpreted his actions as slothful and wicked. How was the master able to see through this? Well, he was slothful because he did nothing. Well, that's easy. If you're supposed to work and you don't do any work, you have to have some reason for that. And he had no other reason. So that was easy to pick out. He was slothful. He didn't work when he was supposed to. But he was wicked because he didn't want the Lord to prosper. I mean, what kind of worker do you want working for you that doesn't want you to benefit? I mean, how many of our jobs would be successful if we worked for them and tried to bring them under? You work at the fast food and you don't charge any money. You're like, oh, they're not paying me enough. Everybody gets free food. You're an accountant, and everybody's forgiven just all the time. Just Take what you want from this company. You work at the hospital. Yeah, everybody's fine. I don't need to do any work. Whatever happens to you happens. In anything that you do that is actually beneficial, and you do that with your, places of ill repute, now we're talking. It'll shut those places down. That's a good thing, but for everything else, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so that's what made him wicked. It was a good thing for him to work, but he didn't want to work because he didn't think he was going to get enough out of it. And that's a sad way of thinking. The two good servants were rewarded with compliments, increased responsibility, and entrance into the Lord's joy. They were faithful over a little, and he says, I'm going to make you ruler over much. But what's the difference with the last one? He wasn't rewarded with compliments. He was reprimanded. He was stripped of his responsibility. He was cast into darkness. But we can learn even more from the unprofitable servant than just how he ended. I mean, that's good enough to see that he ended in a bad place, and don't be like that person, right? That's on the surface, and that's easy and important for us to understand. But there's a little bit more to the story, a little bit more that we can glean from his situation. Through the unprofitable servant, we also learn more about the abilities and the goods, the talent that he was given, the sum of money that he was given. This last servant, though he had only one unit of the goods, had more than one ability. Because they're different. He only had one unit of goods, but he had more than one ability. How can we see this? It is implied that he could have gained by trading like the other servant. The servant with the 5 talents, 5 units of goods. He multiplied it by trading. But he didn't do that. But when the reckoning came, the master said, you didn't do anything, but you could have at least gained by giving it to the bankers to earn interest. So how many options did he have as far as his abilities? He had at least 2. Now, the point isn't to show exactly how many he had. Maybe he had 3 or 4. Maybe he had other ways that he could have gained with this one talent. But he didn't choose any of them. But the Lord wanted him to know that he knew that the servant could have done more. Now, I don't want this to be a reason for anyone to think that they can try to slide by with some other option and say, well, I'm wicked and I don't want to do this, but I can at least do this. Hopefully you just see from it the idea that he had options. He had abilities, and he did not have to trade it like the one with 5 talents. It is implied by the suggestion from the Lord that he would have been fine with him giving it to the bankers, and he would have had interest from it. And it seems as if the Lord would have been happy, at least with that. But we don't know. But I think it just goes to show, it helps me to understand the parable in this light. In the end, he didn't multiply. That's really the point. He had ways to multiply, but he didn't. But it was not his ability that was taken. At the end, it was the money. And it was entrusted to someone who had already proven themselves willing to use the opportunity. And I think that this is very important to see at the end. Even if you have only one unit of the Lord's goods, whatever it may be, and that would be, opportunity for great study and discussion, you may still have many abilities best example I can think of, which is probably not the best example that can be given, but the best one I can think of was the Apostle Paul. Who was he and how was he like before he became the Apostle Paul? We know he was Saul. We know he was a devout Pharisee. But was there anything in particular that was so different from the way he acted or the reasoning behind his action? No. Was he bold and persistent before he was a Christian? Yes. Was he bold and persistent after he was a Christian? Yes, because that was his ability. And God looked on him, Christ looked on him, and matched his ability with the responsibility to spread the gospel as an apostle. And just like the talent, the goods that he gave, apostleship was a position that could be given and taken away. So it at least matches in my mind. We see that with Judas. He said, let someone else take his position, his bishopric. He didn't even get to keep it as a namesake. From this side toward eternity and beyond, the 12 apostles do not include Judas. He was replaced. It was taken away from him. But what do we see with Paul? Paul certainly used his apostleship and he multiplied with it, didn't he? Even when his ability to personally spread the gospel was taken away due to imprisonments, he used other ways. He used other abilities. What did he do? He wrote letters. He invited the Jews to visit him so he could teach them even when he was in prison, even when he couldn't go see them. And on top of that, he even sent out brethren to go and encourage where he could not. His abilities continued even when you took away one, because he had the goods and he was responsible for multiplying it. And he knew that. And nothing but death was going to stop his mission. So what do we see from here? Multiply all the goods, all the talents that you have been entrusted with. And if you lose an ability, go to another and keep on multiplying. Lastly, we have a scene where the Son of Man returns with the holy angels and sits upon the throne of his glory as king. Once again, one class, all nations, split into two sides, his right and his left. The ones on the right are like sheep. The ones on the left are like goats. Now, I definitely think there's wonderful imagery behind the use of these two animals, and I'm sure you already studied into those things as well. The mannerism of these animals. You know, there are good things and bad things, but I'll simply limit my comments to describing them as similar herd animals with differences in how they act. Sheep act differently from goats. And this is also what separates these groups. Their actions. They acted differently. The sheep-like group were good to their brethren. They fed their hunger, satisfied their thirst, invited them in while they were alienated, clothed their nakedness, visited their sickness, and attended to their imprisonment. They did this to the very least of Christ's brethren. The goat-like group did not do the same. Now, we don't know exactly to what extent they did not do this. Was it because they were particular about which of the brethren they would care for? Were they a respecter of persons? Or did they just not help any of the brethren at all? Either way, their lack of action was taken personally by Christ. And it makes sense because he's the head of the body that they neglected. You neglect Christ's body, you don't love his body. And he would not allow them to enter into eternal life when they did not value life. They didn't value their own because they didn't want to make it in. They didn't value the lives of others. And so they had ultimately no respect for life. Why should they enter into life? But think about this. What a disappointment it would be to find out that you have been separated into this group. And this is a horrible thought, because these people probably thought, this is great. I see, like I said before, this seems to be a division of the people who were considered servants. You think, oh, all these servants, and he's like, you go over here, okay, I'll go over here, and next thing you know, it's not good for you over here. You thought this was the end, you thought you made it in, but you didn't make it, because you were not the kind of servant that you were supposed to be. And now that you realize that, now that it's come to your attention, it's too late. I'll leave you with one story. I never really have any stories, because not only am I not good with them, I don't have them anyway, so it's best that they're not left in my hands. But I have one that, actually I think fits kind of perfect. It didn't happen to me, fortunately. Not that I'm above this, but I was told by someone that there was a big announcement, and they sent out flyers and announcements to go to the stadium at the time. I don't know if this was back in Oklahoma. I don't know if it was the baseball stadium or OU stadium or whatever. It was probably the AAA baseball stadium. And so a lot of people got this ticket, and they were supposed to come there, and it was for some prize. And so all these people got this ticket, and they were excited to be there. But then when they got to the stadium and everybody sit down, there was an announcement made that unfortunately it was not a gathering based on winning a ticket or winning the lottery or winning some prize. It was because they had unpaid taxes that they owed a lot of, and it was basically what we would call a group text today to let everyone know that they owed. So can you think of, can you imagine, you think that you're going to get some prize or get something special, only to find out you're reminded of a debt that you didn't pay. Now, in this particular case, they weren't held against their will. They were allowed to leave, and from my understanding, they left en masse. Some people laughed about it and whatever, but they're like, how could they do this? But the sad part about it is this is exactly, pretty much what's going on here. The only difference is that you will be held against your will. Once you find out that you're not in the group that you thought you were in, then it's just the end. It's just destruction. And that is not good. That's very sad, but we are, I believe, still have the opportunity to make the right choice. And as a group of Christians who follow God, to remind ourselves how important it is to be the right type of servant. And so I continue to encourage you, as I feel encouraged by these parables and by these scenarios, to make sure that I'm doing the best I can every day to make sure that I'm living the way I should. But if you have not obeyed the gospel, or if you have obeyed the gospel or straight, or you need help, you need understanding of the word, you feel like there's something missing, just like the ruler that came to Jesus and said, I've done all these things, but I feel something's missing. It's possible for us to think that way today. And if you think something's missing, don't keep it to yourself. Get it corrected. Let us pray with you. Let us pray for you. Let us help you. We want to help each other. We want to make it into that group of all the nations, those people that were considered his servants, and then we want to stay together when we're shifted over to the right side. We don't want anyone to be on that left side. We don't want any goats. We want sheep. So if you are of either class, please make it known as we stand and sing the song selected.